I have told this story exactly twice in 31 years. Once at my retirement dinner, when a young lieutenant asked me the worst mistake I ever made in uniform, and I decided he deserved the true answer instead of the funny one. And once now, to you, because you asked me who taught me the most about being a soldier, and you expected me to name a general. I am going to name a mechanic. My name is Wade Corliss. In the summer this all happened, I was a 26-year-old motor sergeant at a forward sustainment yard we all just called the Ironworks, a dust-colored maintenance compound bolted onto the eastern edge of a coalition logistics hub where the desert didn't so much end as give up. I ran the vehicle bays. I signed for the wrenches, the jacks, the recovery vehicles, the 240-odd rolling machines that kept a brigade's worth of supply convoys alive. I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, which is a dangerous combination in a man that age. I had a loud voice and a clipboard and a way of deciding who a person was inside about 4 seconds of meeting them, and I was proud of that too. I called it reading people. It was not reading people. It was guessing, fast, and then defending the guess like it was scripture. The woman I guessed wrong about arrived on a Tuesday, in the back of a supply truck, with a green duffel and a toolbox that had clearly crossed an ocean, and one sleeve of her coveralls rolled to the elbow against the heat. That rolled sleeve is where the whole thing starts, so let me be careful about it. She stepped down off the tailgate without waiting for a hand, set the toolbox on the gravel like it weighed nothing, though I found out later it weighed a great deal, and squared up to look at the compound the way you'd look at a house you were thinking of renting. Calm, unhurried, late 30s maybe, though the desert lies about ages. Dark hair pulled back hard and going gray at the temple in a way she plainly had never bothered to hide. A face that had been out in weather for a lot of years and had stopped arguing with it. She wore corporal's rank, which even then struck me as strange, because corporals at that age are either a very specific kind of screw-up or something you don't have a box for, and I did not have a box for her, so I filed her under the first one. Her paperwork said she was a wheeled vehicle mechanic on individual augmenti orders, sent to us to help clear a maintenance backlog before the fall push. Motor pool fill, a body with a wrench. That was the whole story the paper told, and I believed the paper because the paper agreed with my 4-second read. "You the new Phil," I said, walking up with the clipboard. "I'm the new Phil," she agreed. "Corliss, motor sergeant. You'll work my bays." I looked at her hands, which is a thing you do. A mechanic's hands tell you more than her file. Hers were scarred and sure, and the nails were cut down to nothing, working hands, and I'll admit that registered, but it registered underneath the louder thing, which was that as she reached down for the toolbox her rolled sleeve slid back another inch, and I saw the tattoo on the inside of her wrist. It was small. A dark band, some fine work above it I couldn't read at that distance, worn and old. And I did the thing I did to everyone, I made it into a story in 4 seconds. Some tough girl ink, a phase, a bar in a garrison town a decade back. I actually felt a flicker of something like disappointment, like I'd caught her out. "We keep sleeves down in the bays," I said, though we didn't particularly in that heat. "Safety." She looked at me for a second. Then she rolled the sleeve down over the tattoo without a word, and that should have told me something, that a person who takes an unearned correction from a stranger without flinching is not a person who is easily rattled, and people who are not easily rattled are usually not easily rattled for a reason. But I read it as her knowing her place. I read everything that summer as people knowing their place, because it flattered mine. "What do I call you?" I asked. "Dell," she said. "Corporal Dell Amya if the sergeant major's around, Dell if he isn't." "Well, Dell," I said, and I heard my own voice do the thing, the little downshift into amused authority. "Welcome to the Ironworks. Try to keep up." Behind me, a couple of my guys had drifted over the way troops do when there's someone new to size up, and one of them, a big loud specialist named Prout, who I'm sorry to say learned his manners from me, caught sight of the tattoo before she rolled the sleeve and made a show of it. "She's got ink," Prout announced, grinning. Motorpool girl's got a little tattoo. What's it say, sweetheart, live laugh lube? The guys laughed. I laughed. I want to be honest with you about that, because the whole point of telling you this is that I don't get to be the good guy in the early part. I laughed at my specialist calling a woman 15 years his senior sweetheart, and mocking a mark on her body he knew nothing about, and I called her Motorpool girl in my own head from that afternoon on, and within a week the whole yard called her that, and it was my fault it stuck, because the tone comes down from the top of a shop and I set the tone. Dell didn't rise to it. She picked up the toolbox, asked which bay was hers, and by the time the rest of us had wandered back to what we were doing, she had it open and was laying tools out on a rag in an order I didn't recognize, which annoyed me, because I like my shop to run one way, my way, and here was the new Phil already doing something her own way on her first hour. That was the first day. I've had 31 years to look at it and I still can't decide which was worse, that I got her so completely wrong, or how good it felt to be so sure. Let me tell you about the ironworks, because the place matters to what happened, and because I want you to understand the world she walked into and how small we all thought it was. We were a maintenance and recovery yard, which in the pecking order of that war was near the bottom of the glory ladder, and near the top of the actually keeping people alive ladder, though we didn't get told that often. Every convoy that rolled north through our sector rolled on tires we'd patched and engines we'd nursed, and armor we'd welded back onto hulls that the enemy had done their best to open. When a truck got hit out on the main supply route, it was our recovery crews that went out under whatever cover we could beg to drag the wreck, and sometimes the crew back in. We were grease and sweat and long hours and a particular gallows humor, and we were proud in the defensive way that people are proud when nobody upstairs seems to notice them. I ran it hard and I ran it well. Trucks moved. That was my whole religion. Trucks move, the mission moves, and anything that slowed a truck down was my enemy, including, I decided early, the strange calm corporal who did things her own way. Except her way kept working. The first thing was a recovery vehicle, a big heavy wrecker we called the Beast, that had been deadlined for 3 weeks with a hydraulic fault 2 different shifts couldn't chase down. It was the single most important vehicle in my yard. Without the Beast we couldn't drag home anything bigger than a light truck, and it sat there useless, and every day it sat there was a day my recovery crews went out under-equipped, and it was eating me alive. I'd had my best guys on it. I'd had contractors look at it. Nothing. Dell asked on her 3rd day if she could look at the Beast. Better men than you have looked at the Beast, I told her, which is a sentence I would give a year of pension to unsay. She just nodded, like I'd said something reasonable, and asked if she could look at it anyway on her own time, after the shift, and I said fine, whatever, mostly to be rid of the conversation. I came in early the next morning to find the Beast running. Not just running clean, the hydraulics smooth as new, the fault gone. Dell was wiping down the last of the lines, and the deck around her was spotless, every tool back in its place, and she'd left a torn-off sheet of cardboard on the driver's seat with the failure written out in a neat hand. A cracked internal seal in a place nobody thinks to look, upstream of the symptom, mimicking 3 other faults so that anyone chasing the symptom chased their tail. She'd found it by pressure testing the whole circuit section by section, methodically, the boring correct way, the way that takes all night and no genius, only patience and knowing where the boring correct way lives. How'd you know to check there? I asked, and I heard to my own disgust that my voice had gone a little wary, a little smaller. Seen it before, she said. On heavier machines, it's a known ghost once you've met it. On heavier machines. I remember thinking that was a funny thing for a motor pool corporal to say, because there wasn't much heavier in my yard than the Beast. I didn't ask what she meant. I told myself she'd read it in a manual. I needed her to be small, so I made the evidence small, and I went and found some other reason to be somewhere else. Prout, when he heard she'd fixed the Beast, said she'd probably gotten lucky. I let him say it. I more than let him. I nodded. The mockery got a name and a rhythm, the way these things do in a shop, and I want to lay it out plainly, because the point of this story is that it was specific and it was aimed, and I own my part in every piece of it. She was motor pool girl to the whole yard within a week. Never Corporal Amya, never dealt to anyone but me, and only when I wanted something. When the guys needed a job nobody wanted, the reeking fuel cell cleanout, the endless tire inventory in the afternoon heat, the latrine-adjacent grease trap, the joke was to give it to the girl, because she never complained, and a person who never complains becomes, in a bad shop, the person you dump things on to prove you can. Prout made the tattoo a running bit. Every few days he'd invent a new guess at what it said, each one a little cruder, always landing on some version of small, girlish, decorative, a butterfly, a boyfriend's initials, a horoscope. He'd say it loud enough for the bae to hear, and the bae would laugh because I laughed, and I want to keep saying that, because I've spent 31 years watching men decide they're just going along with the room without noticing that they are the room. Once, this is the one that I go back to at night, she was carrying a transmission housing across the bay, a genuinely heavy piece, carrying it right because she knew how to carry heavy things, and Prout stuck his foot out. Not to trip her, he said later, just to see if the girl would drop it. She didn't drop it. She stepped over his boot without breaking stride, set the housing down exactly where it needed to go, and turned and looked at him for a long, level moment, and Prout's grin curdled a little under that look, and then she went back to work. I saw the whole thing. I was 30 feet away with my clipboard, and I said nothing. I told myself if it had been serious she'd have said something, and since she didn't say anything it must not have been serious, which is the exact logic every coward in every shop has used since the invention of the shop. Her silence was dignity. I read it as permission. There was a sergeant first class in our compound, a wise old recovery NCO named Tom Beck who ran the wrecker crews and who was everything I pretended to be. Beck watched Dell for about 2 weeks, and then he came and found me one evening by the fuel point and said, "Quiet. You know your new corporal reset the timing on my whole crew's pace without anybody telling her to, and now we're clearing the recovery board faster than we have all deployment." "She's a good wrench," I allowed. "Wade," Beck said, and he looked at me in a way I didn't like, "that's not a good wrench. I've had good wrenches. That woman ran a shop, a big one. You can see it in how she moves through a bay. She's not doing the work, she's watching the whole floor while she does the work. Corporals don't move like that." He let that sit. "Where'd she come from exactly?" "Augmenti orders," I said. "Phil." "From where?" And I realized I didn't know. Her file said Augmenti, and I'd stopped reading at the word that agreed with me. Beck saw me realize it, and he shook his head, not unkindly, and said the thing I've quoted to young sergeants ever since, though I usually don't tell them where I first heard it. "The paper tells you her job," he said. "It doesn't tell you who she is. Those are different questions, and you only ever ask the first one." I told him he was reading too much into a quiet corporal. He shrugged and went back to his wreckers. But it stuck a hook in me, and that night I pulled her file up again, properly this time, and found that the Augmenti orders were real but thin, and that under the routine data there was a security clearance annotation 2 levels above anything a motor pool fill would ever need, and a single line, access restricted, refer inquiries to higher, where a service history should be. I looked at that restricted line for a long time, and then, God help me, I decided it was an administrative error, because the alternative required me to have been wrong all summer, out loud in front of my whole yard, and I was 26 and I could not afford to have been wrong. I closed the file. I did not ask higher. I went asleep telling myself she was motor pool girl and the clearance was a clerk's mistake. I want to tell you about the week between that night and the lockdown, because a lot of men, when they tell a story like this, jump straight from the setup to the payoff, and the jump lets them off easy. It makes it look like they were fooled by circumstance, like the truth was hidden and then suddenly revealed and there was nothing they could have done in between. That's not honest. The truth wasn't hidden that week. It was standing in my bay every single day, in plain sight, doing plain extraordinary things, and I looked at every one of them and found a way to keep her small. So I'm going to make myself tell the in-between, because the in-between is where the shame actually lives. There was the day of the contractor and the generator. We had a big prime power generator that ran the main maintenance bay's overhead lifts and half our diagnostic gear, and it started surging, running rough, dropping load, coming back. A fault that would kill you slowly because you couldn't trust anything you lifted while it was doing it. We had a maintenance contract on that generator, a civilian company, and I called them. And they sent out a specialist who spent most of a day on it with a laptop and a lot of confidence, and left us a bill and a recommendation to replace a very expensive module that would have to be flown in and would deadline the whole main bay for a week. Dell was working a truck in the corner of that bay the whole time the contractor was there. Never said a word. Just worked and listened. The way I'd started to notice she was always listening even when she looked like she was only working. And after the contractor left, she came over to where I was standing looking at that repair estimate with my stomach sinking, because a week without the main bay in that op-tempo was a disaster, and she said, quiet, "It's not the module." "The contractor says it's the module," I said. "The contractor ran the diagnostic the module tells him to run," she said. "The module's reporting its own fault because it's getting dirty power upstream. The surge is a governor problem, a linkage that's worn just enough to hunt under load. Replace the module and you'll be back here in a month with the same surge and a new module reporting the same lie. It's a 2-hour fix and a part you've already got in your bench stock." She paused. "I can show you if you want. I don't want to step on the contract." I should have said yes. Any sergeant with sense would have said yes. What I said, and I remember the exact ugly shape of it, was, "The contractor's a certified specialist on this exact system. You're a motor pool fill. I think I'll go with the certification." She nodded. She didn't argue. She went back to her truck. And I ordered the module, and it took 9 days to fly in. And the main bay ran at half capacity that whole time on a jury rig, and the entire yard limped. And my recovery crews went out under-supported because I couldn't lift what I needed to lift. And if you're doing the arithmetic, yes, those 9 days ran right up to the night of the ambush. So when the worst night of the deployment came, my main bay was still degraded because I'd chosen a stranger's certification over the woman in my own shop who told me the truth for free. The module came. We installed it. The surge came back inside a week, exactly as she'd said, because it had never been the module. By then, though, other things had happened, so let me stay in order. There was the day Beck's youngest record driver, a 19-year-old kid named Sowell, froze up. Sowell had been on a recovery where things went bad, not the big ambush, an earlier one. A smaller hit where he'd watched a truck he was rigging take fire. And he'd come back from it wrong, jumpy, and one afternoon in the bay, a pneumatic line let go with a bang and Sowell just dropped. Hands over his head, shaking, right there on the shop floor in front of everybody. And the bay went dead silent in the worst way. The way that tells a scared kid he's just become a story people will tell. I didn't know what to do. I'm ashamed of that too. I was his shop's senior man and I stood there useless. It was Dell who crossed the bay. She didn't make a scene of it. She got down on the floor next to Sowell, not touching him, and she started talking to him about a torque spec. Just that. A completely ordinary shop question. What's the torque on the lug pattern for the wrecker's outriggers? Walk me through the sequence in a voice so level and so normal that the kid's brain had something to grab that wasn't the fear. And Sowell, shaking, answered her. Torque spec. Sequence. Star pattern. And she asked another one. And another. Ordinary shop questions. Until the kid's hands came off his head and his breathing came down. And he was just a mechanic talking about torque specs with another mechanic on a shop floor. And then she stood him up easy and put a wrench in his hand and set him to a real task. Because she knew, the way I did not know, that the fastest way back for a soldier who's just been ambushed by his own memory is competence. The hands doing a thing they know. The proof that he's still himself. I asked her later how she knew to do that. It was one of the few times all summer I asked her a real question, and she said, not making anything of it, "I've been the one on the floor. Somebody talked me back with a torque spec once. You pass it on." And I filed even that away as nothing, some general life wisdom from a quiet corporal, instead of hearing what it plainly was, which was a combat veteran of the worst kind of recovery telling me, in the gentlest possible terms, exactly who she was. Beck saw all of it. Beck came to me after the Sowell thing and didn't even bother arguing anymore. He just said, "You've got a leader in your shop, Wade, a real one, and you've got her cleaning grease traps, and someday you're going to have to look at that square." And I told him she was a good wrench with a good bedside manner, and he looked at me the way you look at a man who is standing in the rain insisting it's dry, and he walked away. And there was the mockery still, running underneath all of it, because a shop's cruelty doesn't stop just because the person keeps proving it wrong. Sometimes it gets worse, because being proven wrong is exactly the thing a certain kind of pride can't stand, and it answers competence with more contempt rather than less. Prute's tattoo bits got meaner as the summer went on, not kinder, precisely because she kept being good and he needed her to be small. The grease-strap details kept landing on her. And she took it all with that same level water calm, and I kept reading the calm as her knowing her place. And every single day the truth stood in my bay in coveralls, and I told it to cover its sleeves. That's the in-between. 9 days of a flown-in module she told me not to order. A kid talked back from the floor with a torque spec by a woman who'd been on that floor herself. A recovery NCO telling me plainly I had a leader on grease-strap detail. The truth wasn't hidden. I just wouldn't ask the second question. 9 days after I closed her file, the base went to lockdown, and I found out exactly whose mistake it was. The thing that changed everything started, like most bad days out there, with a radio. It was a little after 4 in the morning. I was in the shop office running the night's numbers when the base net came up hot, not the routine chatter, the other kind, the kind that makes every soldier who spent time downrange sit up before their brain has even caught the words. A convoy had been hit hard out on the northern route, worse than the usual harassment. Multiple vehicles disabled, at least one gun truck burning, casualties on the ground, and the ambush wasn't a hit and run. The enemy had set it as a trap with depth, with a follow-on force, and they were pressing, trying to overrun the survivors before anyone could reach them. The quick reaction force was already spinning up. And the survivors were pinned in a wadi with their comms half shot out and their vehicles dead, which meant the only way anybody was getting them and their trucks home was recovery, under fire, fast, and recovery was mine. I got Beck out of his cot before the tasking even hit us formally. We both knew it was coming. The QRF could fight to them, but the QRF couldn't drag 4 disabled heavy trucks and a burning gun truck out of a kill zone. That took wreckers. That took the beast. That took my crews going out into an active ambush with grease under their nails and thin skin on their trucks, and I felt the whole weight of it land on me at once, the way command weight lands. And I was, I'll tell you plainly, scared not for me, for the fact that I was about to send men I was responsible for into a fire I couldn't see the edges of. And then the second problem hit, the one that made the first one look simple. The route out to that convoy ran through a maintenance choke point, a narrow defile where the road had washed out months back and been patched with a temporary vehicle bridge, a heavy modular thing that a recovery column had to cross to reach the northern route at all. And that bridge had been throwing a fault for 2 days. My guys had flagged it. Under normal load it held. Under the weight of the beast plus a loaded recovery train at speed, under fire, with the margins gone, nobody could tell me it would hold. And if it dropped a wrecker into that defile, the whole rescue was over before it started, and I'd have added my own men to the casualty list. I stood in the shop with Beck and my crews assembling around me in the dark, all of them looking at me, and I did not know if the bridge would hold, and there was no time to find out the slow way, and I felt my certainty, the thing I'd run my whole shop on, just drain out of the bottom of me. "Sergeant Corliss," Dell's voice from the edge of the group, quiet but it cut through. "The bridge at the defile, the fault they flagged, what's the reported symptom?" I told her short, because we didn't have time, but something in me grabbed at the question the way a drowning man grabs at anything. She listened. Then she said, "That's not a load fault. That's a pin-end bearing fault in the transom set. It reads like a load fault because the deflection shows up under weight, but the failure point is the pins, and the pins are a known series that came out of a bad lot. I've crossed that exact bridge type on heavier loads than anything you've got. If it's the pins, I can tell in 4 minutes whether it holds your column, and if it's the pins and only the pins, I can shim it to carry you across for exactly the number of passes you need. But you have to let me look, and you have to let me look now, and I'm going to need to ride out to the defile with the lead wrecker to do it." The bay went quiet. Prout, God bless the reliability of a fool, actually laughed one short bark and said, "The girl wants to ride out on the recovery." And Beck turned on him so fast and so cold that Prout's laugh died in his throat. "Shut your mouth, specialist," Beck said, and then Beck looked at me, and everything I've told you about Beck being the man I was pretending to be came down to this one moment because he said, "Wade, she's the only person in this compound who just described that fault correctly. My guys called it a load fault. She called it in the pins and she called the bad lot standing across a bay in the dark. You want to bet those men in that wadi on your pride, or on the one person here who actually knows? I want to tell you I chose wisely because I was wise. I chose wisely because I was terrified and Beck had left me nowhere to hide." I looked at Dell, motorpool girl, the Phil, sweetheart, live laugh lube, standing there having just laid out the exact failure of a bridge my whole shop had gotten wrong, in language that no motorpool corporal I'd ever met could have used, calm as still water while grown men fell apart around her. And something in me finally, cracked open the door I'd been holding shut all summer. "Get your gear," I said. "You ride the lead wrecker. Beck runs the column. Corporal Amya calls the bridge." "Corliss," Prout started, "you can't seriously." "That's an order, specialist," I said, and my voice wasn't doing the amused authority downshift anymore. It had gone somewhere flat and real. "And if you say one more word about that woman, I will leave you here counting tires until this war ends. Move." They moved. I didn't go out on the recovery. The motor sergeant stays and runs the shop. That's the job, so what I know of the next 2 hours I know from Beck, from the crews and from the net, which I sat and listened to with my knuckles white on the edge of the desk. But I've heard it enough times from enough of them that I can tell it true. The column ran dark and fast to the defile. Dell was off the lead wrecker before it fully stopped, down into the defile with a light in her hands. And Beck said watching her work was like watching someone read in a language he didn't know existed. She went straight to the transom pins, not the deck, not the load points. The pins, pulled an inspection cover nobody on my staff had ever thought to pull, put her light on the bearing race and called it in 90 seconds. Pin-end bearing failure, the bad lot, exactly as she'd said in the bay. And then, and this is the part that made Beck's voice go strange every time he told it, she didn't panic and she didn't hedge. She looked at the pins, and she looked at the weight of the column, and she did some arithmetic in her head that Beck said he'd have needed a manual and a calculator and an hour for, and she said, "It'll carry 6 heavy passes if I shim the number 3 and number 5 transoms, and we cross them one at a time at walking speed, spaced. Not 7, 6. Somebody keep the count. 6 passes. There were exactly 6 vehicles in the recovery train." She shimmed the transoms with hardware off the wreckers, working fast and clean in the dark with the sound of the fight carrying down the defile from the north. And she stood at the head of that bridge and walked every single wrecker across it herself, one at a time, on foot, at a walk, her hand up counting, because she would not trust the count to anyone else and she would not stand anywhere but on the bridge she was vouching for. 6 times, a loaded recovery vehicle rolled across a bridge my whole shop had condemned. And 6 times it held, because a corporal I'd made scrub grease traps had read it right down to the pin. Then the column went north into the fight, and Dell went with it, because the recovery wasn't done and she wasn't the kind to fix the door and go home. What happened at the Wadi, I heard mostly from a gun truck sergeant named Ruiz, who was one of the survivors, and who came and found me weeks later specifically to make sure I understood what my motor pool girl had done, because he'd figured out from the way people talked that back at the ironworks she wasn't respected, and it made him angry in a way I've never forgotten. The recovery train reached the pinned convoy while the fight was still on. The QRF had bought a foothold, but the enemy hadn't quit. They were still working the flanks, still trying to overrun before the wreckers could pull the disabled trucks clear. Recovery under fire is a horror. You're big, slow, unarmored targets doing delicate mechanical work while people try to kill you. And the recovery got complicated fast. Because the burning gun truck had a trapped crewman, the vehicle settled wrong and pinning his leg, and getting him out was a mechanical problem and a medical problem and a tactical problem, all braided together with the clock running and rounds coming in. Beck told me that at that point, without anybody deciding it, the whole recovery reorganized itself around Dell, not because she took charge with a speech, because she started solving the problem out loud in a voice so level and so certain that everyone within earshot just began doing what the voice said, the way you follow the one calm person in a burning building. She got the trapped man out by rigging a controlled lift off a wrecker boom, reading the load, calling the angle, easing the wreck up exactly enough and no more while a medic pulled the man free. A lift that Ruiz swore should have taken a specialist recovery team and a manual, done in the open under fire by a woman kneeling in the dirt with her hand up reading a load nobody else could see. And here is the part where the paper stopped being able to explain her. The enemy pushed a vehicle-borne attack up the road toward the Wadi, a technical, a gun mounted on a truck, coming fast to break the recovery. The gun trucks in the Wadi were half disabled, the QRF was committed on the flanks, and for about 10 seconds there was a hole in the defense right where that technical was aiming. Ruiz said everyone saw it and nobody could get to it. And Dell, the mechanic, the Phil, the girl, was already moving, not away from it but toward the nearest disabled gun truck, up into a turret whose weapon 2 people had written off as jammed, and she cleared the jam. She cleared a weapon jam under fire, on a system she supposedly had no business knowing, in about the time it takes to read this sentence, and she put that gun back into the fight and broke the technical's charge before it reached the recovery. Cleared the jam, laid the gun, ran it right, and did not miss what she needed not to miss. Ruiz said the thing he remembered most was that she wasn't frantic. Men around her were screaming, the way men do in that, and she was quiet, calling what she was doing so the crew could follow, and when it was over and the technical was stopped and the recovery could finish, she climbed down out of that turret and went straight back to the wrecker boom and finished rigging the disabled trucks for tow like nothing had happened, because the trucks still had to come home, and that was still the job. I made Ruiz tell me the rigging part twice, because Ruiz was infantry and didn't fully grasp what he was describing, but I did, and it's the part that still stops my breath. Rigging 4 disabled heavy trucks for recovery under fire is not one job, it's 40 small jobs, each of which can kill the whole effort if you get it wrong. You have to read each wreck, where it's damaged, where it'll take load, where the frame's compromised, whether the thing will roll or drag or come apart the second you put tension on it. You have to pick the tow point, and if you pick wrong, you tear the point out under load and now you've got a loose 1,000-pound piece of steel whipping around a kill zone full of your own people. You have to sequence it, which truck comes out first so it doesn't block the others, how the recovery train forms up so it can actually move. Dell did all of that in the dark under fire for 4 vehicles, in her head, walking from wreck to wreck with a light in her scarred hands, calling each tow point, and each sequence out loud so Beck's crews could rig while she read the next one. Ruiz said she never stopped moving and never raised her voice and never got one wrong, and that a recovery that the manual would tell you needed a full specialist recovery team and daylight, and no enemy got done by one woman and a handful of grease monkeys in the middle of a firefight, because she could read a broken truck the way the rest of us read a road sign. And she did one more thing that Ruiz didn't understand and I did. When they got the burning gun truck's crewman free, the one pinned under the settled wreck, the medic wanted to move him fast, and Dell stopped them. She'd seen how the wreck was sitting on him, and she called that if they yanked him the way the panic wanted, the shift would crush the leg worse, and he'd bleed out before they cleared the wadi. She made them do it her way, the slow, controlled lift off the boom, easing the exact weight off the exact spot, and it cost them 90 seconds they were all screaming not to spend, and it saved the man's leg and probably his life. 90 seconds of holding a whole terrified crew to the correct slow procedure while the world came apart around her. That's not a mechanic. I didn't have a word for what that was yet. I was about to be handed one. They brought everyone home. Every survivor, every body, every disabled truck, back across a bridge that held for exactly the 6 passes she'd promised, and no more Beck said the 7th vehicle, a QRF truck that fell in behind uninvited on the return. She flatly refused to let cross until she'd checked and reshimmed, because she'd vouched for 6 and would not be made a liar by a truck. They got everyone home. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a satellite radio in a headquarters a long way away had lit up with a report that a coalition recovery operation on the northern route had been salvaged, under fire, by an individual augmentee whose clearance annotation flagged to a very short list of people who were extremely interested to know exactly where she was. I didn't know that part yet. What I knew, sitting in my shop as the dawn came up gray, and the column called that it was inbound with All Souls, was that motorpool girl had gone out into the worst night of that deployment and pulled off things I couldn't have done, that Beck couldn't have done, that no one in my yard could have done, and that I had spent a summer letting my shop call her sweetheart. I went out to the gate to meet the column in. I don't know exactly what I meant to say. Something had come loose in me, and I think I meant to apologize, clumsy and inadequate, right there in the gravel. I never got the chance, because the black SUVs got there first. They came in fast and they came in ordered. Which is the thing you notice. 3 black SUVs with base-authorized plates and a light escort, moving with the specific unhurried speed of people who have permission to be anywhere they want. They didn't stop at the main gate and ask. The gate came up for them like the gate had been told. And within about 4 minutes of the recovery column rolling back into the compound, every vehicle exit of the ironworks, the main gate, the fuel point gate, the back service gate the contractors used, had a vehicle across it and a person standing beside the vehicle who did not look like a maintenance troop. The whole yard sealed. Nobody in, nobody out. And in a compound full of soldiers who'd spent the night listening to a firefight on the net, a sudden lockdown by unmarked SUVs is the kind of thing that makes 200 people go very quiet and very still all at once, because the range of things it could mean runs from bad to much worse. My first thought, I'm ashamed of it but I promised you the truth, was that Dell had done something wrong. That the restricted line in her file was the bad kind of restricted, that motorpool girl was some sort of problem the Army had misplaced and just now found, and that the SUVs were here to collect her. That's how deep the story I'd told myself went. Even watching those vehicles seal my gates with military precision, my first instinct was to fit her into the small box, to make even this about her being less than she seemed rather than more. I was standing near the lead wrecker as the crews dismounted, filthy and hollow-eyed and alive, and Dell climbed down last, greased to the elbows, a smear of somebody else's blood dried on her sleeve, moving with the particular slowness of someone who has spent everything they had. She saw the SUVs. She saw the sealed gates. And here is the thing that finally completely broke my 4-second read of her. She was not surprised. She looked at the black SUVs the way you look at weather you'd been expecting. A little tired, a little resigned, even. And she reached up and rolled her sleeve back down over that tattoo, deliberately, the same gesture as her first day. Except now I understood I was about to find out I'd never understood it at all. A man got out of the center SUV. Older, spare, in a plain uniform with 2 stars on it and no fuss around the stars. The kind of general who has stopped needing anyone to be impressed. He was flanked by 2 others, a full colonel and a command sergeant major, the senior enlisted soldier in whatever formation this was, a hard old man with a chest full of nothing showy just earned. They did not swagger. They moved toward the recovery crews with purpose, and the yard parted around them. And Prout, I noticed, had gone the specific color of a man who has just realized he has been loud in the wrong room for a very long time. The general's eyes went across the crews and found Dell, and something in his face changed, not to surprise, but to a kind of relief that had been held under pressure a long time and was only now allowed to show. "Chief," he said. Just that, and it landed on the yard like a dropped wrench, because chief is not a word you say to a corporal. Chief is what you call a chief warrant officer, the technical masters of the army, and it was said in the tone you'd use to appear you'd been worried sick about. Dell, Corporal Amya, Motorpool Girl, the girl, came to a version of attention that even exhausted was cleaner than anything my whole yard could manage, and said, "Sir." The command sergeant major stepped forward, and this old senior enlisted man, who had probably not explained himself to a soul in 20 years, turned and addressed the yard, because he had clearly taken one look at how this compound talked to the woman in front of him, and decided we were going to hear it whether we could stand it or not. "For those of you who have been working alongside this soldier," the sergeant major said, and his voice was not loud but it reached every corner of that yard, "and calling her whatever you've been calling her, you're going to want to stand still for this." Then the general did the thing I have carried for 31 years. He had a folder in his hand, a sealed personnel file, the real one, the one behind the restricted line I'd closed rather than read. And he opened it, and he read from it, aloud to my whole silent yard, because he had evidently decided the same thing the sergeant major had, that the record was going to be spoken out loud in the exact place it had been disrespected. He read her true rank, Chief Warrant Officer, senior grade, a master technician of the recovery and maintenance world with more years in uniform than I had in life. He read the assignment history that the restricted line had hidden, that she was not a fill and had never been a fill, that she was a master-level maintenance and recovery warrant officer sent to us deliberately and quietly under a corporal's cover and augmentee orders as part of an evaluation. That command had a problem with how forward maintenance yards actually functioned under real pressure versus how they reported functioning, and that they had a very small number of trusted senior technicians they inserted, disguised, into troubled or critical yards to see the truth of them from the inside and to be there, unannounced, when the truth got tested. She was one of exactly a handful of people in the entire theater qualified to do that work, and the yard she had been inserted into was mine. He read her call sign, because a warrant officer of that specific lineage, the ones who go into the worst mechanical disasters under fire and bring the machines and the people out, carry one, and hers, earned years before across a career I'd condemned to grease traps, was Ironhide. Ironhide. Read aloud in my own yard over my own crews, about the woman my own specialist had asked if her tattoo said, "Live Laugh Lube." And then the general read the last part, the part that put the sound out of the whole compound, because it explained the tattoo I'd corrected her for on day one. The fine work above the dark band on the inside of her wrist was not a butterfly and not a boyfriend's initials. It was a unit marking and a short list of dates, a memorial, worn on the inside of the wrist where a mechanic's wrist rests against the machine, For a recovery crew she had lost years earlier in an operation the file described in one flat classified line, an operation in which then-younger Chief Warrant Officer Amya had, per the citation the general now read, gone back under fire 3 times to recover trapped crewmen from burning vehicles, and had brought out more men alive than anyone had a right to, and had been decorated for valor at a level that made the colonel beside the general come quietly to attention just hearing it read. She wore her dead on the inside of her wrist, and on her first day I had told her to cover it up, for safety. The yard did not make a sound. 200 soldiers who had spent a summer calling this woman, the girl, stood in the gray dawn light and could not find one thing to say. And Dell, Chief Warrant Officer Amya, Ironhide, stood there in her grease and another man's dried blood, and did not gloat. That is the thing I need you to understand, because it's the thing that finished the job of remaking me. She had every right on this earth to a moment of triumph. She had earned it 3 times over, in the years the file described and on the bridge and in the wadi. The whole yard that had mocked her stood exposed and silent, and she could have looked at any one of us, at me most of all, and let us have it. She didn't. Her face, when the general finished reading, held nothing but a kind of weary steadiness, and when she spoke, all she said was, to the general, quiet. "The yard did good work last night, sir. Sergeant Beck's crews and Sergeant Corliss's shop got everyone home. I'd like that in the record, too." She put us in the record. Us. The shop that had dumped grease traps on her. After everything, her one move in that moment was to make sure the general knew the crews had done well. The general looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked out at the yard, and then he did the thing that broke the last of me. This 2-star general, this man who had flown into a firefight's aftermath to lay eyes on one of his most valuable people, came to attention and saluted her. A general, saluting a woman wearing corporal's rank in a motor pool, because he knew what the rank on her collar was hiding, and he was not going to let the disguise stop him from rendering what she was owed. And the colonel saluted, and the command sergeant major saluted, and it hung there, 3 of the most senior soldiers on that base at attention in the gravel in front of the recovery crews, and the whole yard understood at last, all at once, exactly how wrong it had been. Dell returned the salute cleanly, correctly, and I noticed, because I have replayed it 10,000 times, that she held it just a half-second longer than she had to, the way the senior soldier does when the salute is real and both people know it. And then she dropped it last, and the moment released. I have to tell you about Prout, because Prout is where you find out whether a person can be remade or only shamed. Prout walked across that yard, every eye on him, his face gray, his loud summer collapsed to nothing, and he stopped in front of Chief Warrant Officer Amya, and he could barely get the words out. "Ma'am," he said, "the things I said, about your," and he couldn't even say the word tattoo, "about you. I was wrong, ma'am. I don't have any excuse. I'm sorry." And then this big, loud specialist who had asked a decorated warrant officer if her memorial to her dead said "Live Laugh Lube," came to attention and saluted her, and his hand was shaking. Dell looked at him for a moment, the same level look she'd given him across the bay the day he stuck his foot out, except now the whole yard understood what was behind it. And she returned his salute, correct and unhurried, and she said, and I have never forgotten the exact words because they were the most generous thing I ever heard one soldier say to another. "You carried heavy things all summer and never dropped one, specialist. You've got the hands for this work. Learn to read people the way you're going to learn to read a machine, and you'll be a good one." She gave him a way to become better instead of just a wound to carry. She handed the man who'd mocked her a future. Prout wept, right there, and nobody in that yard thought less of him for it because half of us were fighting the same thing. Then it was my turn, and mine was the hardest, because I was the one who had set the tone. Prout learned his manners from me. The whole yard called her the girl, because I called her the girl first. A shop is a mirror of the man who runs it, and every cruelty in that summer had my fingerprints on it whether my hand did it or not. I walked over to her. I was 26 and I had run out of every place to hide, and I stood in front of a warrant officer I'd assigned to clean grease traps, and I found I couldn't do the clean thing Pruitt had done, couldn't get it into a neat apology because it was too big. So I just said the true thing. "I read your file on day 9, I said. "I saw the restricted line and the clearance, and I decided it was a clerk's mistake because the truth meant I'd been wrong all summer in front of my whole shop, and I couldn't afford that. I chose my pride over asking one question. Everything that happened to you in my yard happened because I would rather be certain than be right. There's no apology that covers it, ma'am. I just want you to know I know exactly what I did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've spent the rest of my career trying to be worthy of. "You sent me out on that recovery," she said. "When Beck told you to trust the person who read the bridge right, you did it, and you shut your specialist down to do it, and you didn't have to. A lot of men in your boots would have held on to being right and gotten those men in the wadi killed to protect it. You let go of it at the one moment it mattered." She looked at me level. "Being wrong all summer is a thing you can fix, Sergeant. You've got 30 years to fix it. Getting men killed to protect your pride, you don't get to fix. You chose the right one when the bill came due. Now go be the kind of sergeant who reads people before the bill comes due, and we'll call it square." She didn't let me off. Read it again, she didn't. She named exactly what I'd done and told me it was mine to carry. But she gave me the same thing she gave Pruitt, a road out that ran through becoming better instead of just staying ashamed. She treated the worst version of me as a draft, not a verdict. Then she turned to go with the general, because people at her level don't get to linger, and she stopped, and she rolled her sleeve back up, this time uncovering the tattoo she'd hidden all summer at my order, and she held her wrist so I could see the fine work above the dark band, the unit marking and the dates, her dead carried against the machine. "You told me to cover this on my first day," she said, not angry, almost gentle. "I want you to have seen it before I go. These were my crew. I bring machines and people home because I couldn't bring them home. That's the whole reason there's an Ironhide." She let me look for one more second. "A man who'd made me cover them up all summer sent me out to bring 6 trucks and a wadi full of your soldiers home last night, and I did it wearing them. So it worked out. But look next time. The thing you tell a person to hide is usually the thing you most needed to know." And then she was gone, into the center SUV, out through a gate that opened for her the way it had all along, off to whatever troubled yard needed Ironhide next. The lockdown lifted. The black SUVs pulled out as ordered as they'd arrived, and 200 soldiers stood in a motor pool in the gray morning light and did not, for a long while, go back to work, because you don't just go back to work after the floor of your certainty falls out from under you all at once. That was 31 years ago. I made chief warrant officer myself eventually, went the maintenance and recovery road, the one she was master of, partly because after that summer I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I ran a lot of shops over a lot of years, and in every single one of them, the first thing I told a new soldier and the last thing I told them when I retired was the same thing. The paper tells you their job. It does not tell you who they are. Those are different questions. And most of the cruelty in this world, the small daily kind that men in shops do to each other, comes from people who asked only the first question, got an answer that flattered them and stopped. I stopped at Motor Pool Girl. I had a master warrant officer, a decorated combat recovery specialist, one of a handful of people in the theater trusted to do what she did, standing in my bay, and I looked at her scarred working hands and the memorial on her wrist, and I asked only the first question, and I got the whole thing wrong for a summer, out loud, in front of everyone, and it took black SUVs sealing my gates and a general reading her file to the sky to make me ask the second one. I never saw her again. I looked over the years, the way you look for a person who changed your life and got no thanks for it. Warrant officers of her kind don't leave much trail on purpose. But I heard things now and then, the way you do. A troubled yard turned around somewhere. A recovery pulled off that shouldn't have been possible. A quiet corporal who wasn't a corporal. And every time I hoped it was her, and I hoped that yard had the sense to ask the second question faster than I did. You asked me who taught me the most about being a soldier, and you expected a general. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer Amya. The Yard called her the girl. The Army called her Ironhide. She wore her dead on the inside of her wrist, and I told her to cover them up on the first day, and she brought a waddy full of my soldiers home anyway, and then she taught the man who'd wronged her how to be worth more than he was. Read people before the bill comes due. That's the whole lesson. It cost me a summer of shame, and it cost her nothing but grace to give it to me, and I have spent 31 years trying to pass it along cheaper than I bought it. Cover your sleeves down in the bays, we say, for safety. Look at what a person's hiding first. That's the safety that actually matters.